Today's episode covers one of the most documented paranormal experiences in U.S. history. The Bell Witch legend was so pervasive it's attracted the attention of ghost hunters, spiritualists, and historians for 200 years. A movie, The American Haunting, is loosely based on this legend. Starting in 1817, the Bell family of Adams, Tennessee, just outside of Nashville, were haunted by a violent entity for 3 years. The news of this haunting became so popular that it said Andrew Jackson traveled to experience the spirit himself. It's a vengeful spirit, a cursed family, a doomed engagement, and the only murder ever officially credited to a paranormal entity in American history. All of this and more in today's episode, The Curse of the Bell Witch. Hello and welcome to the very first episode of Highway to Hell. My name is Monty Mater. I'll be your host. I am a fitness professional and a metal vocalist who is also extremely passionate about travel and true crime. This particular show is going to be a travel podcast focusing on true crime and paranormal stories. So every single week, I'm going to take you to a different city, tell one of their famous stories, and then give you travel recommendations at the end of the episode. Since I'm based here in Nashville, and Nashville obviously is a really popular travel destination right now, I decided I would start right here at home, and I'm so excited. I've been wanting to do this podcast for 2 years, and it took a while to get things rolling, and I'm recording in my apartment because done is better than perfect. And let's jump in. Today I'm going to be talking about one of the most documented paranormal cases in U.S. history. The Bell Witch legend was so pervasive it has attracted the attention of ghost hunters, spiritualists, and historians for over 200 years. The movie An American Haunting is loosely based on this legend, and this started in 1817 with the Bell family of Adams, Tennessee, just outside Nashville, where they were haunted by a violent entity for 3 years. The news of this haunting became so popular in Tennessee that Andrew Jackson is said to have taken a trip to experience the spirit himself. A vengeful spirit, a cursed family, a doomed engagement, and this is the only murder officially attributed to a paranormal entity in American history. All this and more on today's episode. We're going to jump in to The Curse of the Bell Witch. John Bell Sr. was born in 1750 in Edgecombe County, North Carolina. He spent his early years as a cooper's apprentice, and if you're like me and you don't know what a cooper is off the top of your head, it's someone who makes casks and barrels. After saving enough money coopering, he left to pursue farming and having a family. In 1782, which was 1 year before the end of the American War for Independence, 32-year-old John Bell Sr. married 12-year-old Lucy Williams. Now, if you're like me and you read that, your first thought is, gross. Second thought is, well, they got married a lot younger back then. And then your third thought is, yeah, but that seems like really young. So brief little sidebar on this because I got distracted researching this. The average age for women marrying in the colonies in the late 1600s was 19.8 years old and 21.2 years old early in the 1700s. So even though they did get married younger overall back then, 12 would have been extremely young. Extremely young. Even in the Middle Ages, the Catholic Church, the age of consent was 12. Even though royalty could marry before that, which is super weird, you would basically have to wait for her to come of age. But in the time frame that we're in the 1800s, this would have been highly unusual. This would have been very unusual, not just because of the age difference and because of how young she was, but because it was his first marriage. Typically, when you saw a larger age gap, it was a man who was a widower who got remarried to a younger woman who hadn't been married yet. So, yeek, I just can't imagine. I know it's a different time, but that is just, Anyways, so John Bell Sr. marries 12-year-old Lucy Bell. They would spend nearly 2 decades as some of the most successful tobacco farmers in the region and have 6 children: Jesse, John Jr., Drury, Benjamin, Esther, Zadok, Elizabeth, Richard Williams, and Joel Egbert. After a major crop failure in 1801 and another in 1804, the Bell family decided to uproot in the winter of the same year and face the journey through the mountains of eastern Tennessee terminating several months later in the northwestern Robertson County, an area referred to as the Barren Plains. For an idea of how difficult this relocation would have been, consider that when Lucy was married, her father gifted her and John 2 slaves. Slaves was still legal at the time. Chloe and her young son Dean. During their marriage, Lucy has 6 kids. Chloe has 8 during that time. Benjamin Bell did die as an infant, but travel necessitated moving 17 people with livestock, supplies, by wagon to another state. It was a total distance of about 630 miles. This journey would take 9 hours maybe 9.5 hours in a modern vehicle on well-paved roads. It would take a very long time moving that many people by wagon without any real paved roads in certain areas. The Bell family did survive the long journey without any documented incident and arrived safely to their 320-acre homestead on the Red River. The Bell family quickly became successful. They were well liked, they were respected, and really didn't have any kind of scandal until the beginning of the haunting. And there's a lot of variation in the tales surrounding the Bell Witch. They all seem to agree that a single encounter in 1817 kicked everything off. On a summer day, while John Bell Sr. was walking through his cornfield, he was confronted by an animal unlike anything he'd ever seen. It was an enormous hound with thick, matted black fur lay before him in a corn row, unflinching and staring at him intently, as if calmly daring him to make the first move. The creature sat motionless in the dusty, sun-baked clay and just glared at John, noticeably not panting like a dog should on a hot day. Some sources claim that the beast was grotesquely misshapen, a twisted and mangled frame with the head of a rabbit and smoldering red ruby eyes. John pulled out his rifle and fired at the hound. While he should have at least injured it, it turned immediately and ran off with incredible speed, vanishing instantly through the tree line. John had never seen the hound again, never spoke about the sighting to anyone until the haunting started to continue. And this is partly, if it was me, the first thing I would be doing is running home screaming, telling people what I saw. But back in this time, everything was based on the church. The family's deeply religious. You don't want to be associated with demons or Satan or darkness. This was definitely something, the reason he wouldn't have said anything is to keep it very, very hush-hush. Days later, while tending to some work around the farm, 25-year-old Drury Bell spotted a very peculiar large bird perched on a nearby fence. Assuming it was some kind of turkey, Drew raced into the house to grab a rifle. He approached the bird, opened fire, and missed it completely. It spread its wings, which were enormous, and it took off, just leaving Drew standing there. It was huge enough that it definitely wasn't a turkey, but it was unlike any bird the Bell boys had ever observed, and both of these sightings would later be considered the beginning of the haunting. Here I want to take a really cool historical break that might have impacted the legend of the Bell Witch. I had heard the legend of the Bell Witch a long time before I ever visited the cave or before I researched this episode. I did not know this until I started researching this episode, and it's just a really cool kind of historical piece of this. In 1815, 10,000 miles away from Adams, Tennessee, on a remote island in the Dutch East Indies, the most powerful volcanic eruption ever recorded would cause massive destruction to modern-day Indonesia and the surrounding islands, and it would usher in a period of such dramatic climate change it would cripple economies and cause mass starvation around the globe. Mount Tambora erupted, violently ejecting a column of superheated ash and tephra through the stratosphere to an altitude of 45 kilometers. That's 148,000 feet. Light particles blanketed the earth with a cloud the size of Australia, causing a drop in the global climate. Drastically cooler temperatures gave way to snow and frost in June and July, and in 1816, it was given the moniker of the year without summer. The temperatures were so cold, it wiped out crops, causing widespread famine throughout North America and Europe. Western Europe at large was still recovering from food shortages and damages from the Napoleonic Wars that took place between 1803 and 1815. So in 1816, now there's a climate change. The crops are dying from the cold, and as supplies dwindled, food prices rocket. Great Britain and Ireland were soaked in torrential rains, causing catastrophic failure of oat, wheat, and potato harvests. A mass migration of families from Wales traveled long distances to beg for food. Violent demonstrations took place in cities throughout the continent, often targeting granaries and bakeries. New strains of cholera broke out in India and the northeastern United States, and the North American lakes and rivers remained frozen in July as far down as Pennsylvania. Specifically in eastern Tennessee, summer temperatures frequently dipped into the low 30s Fahrenheit with drastic and unpredictable fluctuations in excess of 60 degrees. The disaster caused crop failure, massive food shortages, and unusual migration of animals. Residents of the volunteer state reported pockets of eerie reddish fog that would stay long after sunrise. It would remain for days or weeks, and really unusual animals started popping up that wouldn't normally be local to the region. So it's possible that what John and Drury saw might have been the migration of a non-native animal that was searching for food during a temporarily altered climate. Considering how superstitious people were back then, it would not surprise me if they considered this climate change. Obviously, they don't know about the volcano. They consider this climate change to be an act of God or something happening. And then right after this climate change happens, this haunting starts with the family. So it's an interesting little tie-in that very well could have impacted people's willingness to believe this kind of thing, or, again, seeing strange animals that you wouldn't normally see. At the very least, it's worth keeping in mind that the Bells had experienced a really bizarre and very stressful year in 1816, the year before the haunting started in 1817. Shortly after the sighting of the massive bird, during an evening stroll through some large trees near the house, young Betsy Bell and some of the other children encountered what she described as a pretty little girl dressed in green, swinging from the limb of a tall oak tree. When they moved closer to the green girl, she vanished. The Bell's slave Dean also offered several disturbing accounts involving the sudden appearance of a menacing black fog on his nightly walks to visit his wife at neighboring Alex Gunn residence. Dean claimed the dog would trot along before him down the road before abruptly just vanishing. The dog was described as having either two heads or no head at all, depending on the night. Several encounters with the terrifying apparition were enough to ensure Dean never again left the Bell farm without an axe and the witch ball that his wife had fashioned for his protection. And another question I had going through this research is, he's traveling to this other plantation or this neighboring property to see his wife, which was actually super common. In the early 19th century, the marriage of slaves did not have any legal standing or protection from slave owners. Couples would often be split and sold to different plantation owners to prevent spouses from attempting to escape with each other, and they could only visit a partner on a neighboring plantation or property with consent. House servants would occasionally be granted permission to have a marriage ceremony. Most slaves held small ceremonies on their own to declare their union within their community, and then they could move into the same cabin if granted permission by the slave owner. Dr. Tyler D. Perry, an assistant professor of African American and African diaspora, I gotta look that word up, studies at University of Nevada, said, jumping the broom has always been a practice from its inception used by people who are ostracized and oppressed by a broader state, nation, or kingdom. And jumping the broom, I did associate with slave weddings, so I researched the history of that, and I assume that this practice originated in Africa. There's a similar Ghana tradition where they use a broom to ward off spirits, but I was surprised in my research to see that it's actually not from Africa originally. It originated by ostracized rural groups in Europe. The practice is seen across Celtic, Roma, Welsh, and even Jewish traditions throughout various persecutions in history, like if you look at the Inquisitions. It was basically used as a way to recognize a union for groups that did not follow the Roman Catholic Church. And as those marginalized groups moved over to the U.S., it was adopted by the U.S.'s marginalized group, which was enslaved African Americans. The earliest documentation we have of the practice here in the United States for enslaved Africans is in the 1800s. They saw jumping the broom as a way to recognize their union in an evil culture that didn't legally allow them to be married. It eventually transformed into a symbol sweeping away the old, embracing the new, declaring their union, and paying homage to their ancestors. While Dean's encounter is now included in the tale of the Bell Witch, it's unlikely during that time that people gave him any credit for his encounters or really took his opinion into consideration. Now, shortly after these sightings, Lucy Bell was cleaning and organizing the dining area as John Bell sat low in his favorite chair, exhausted from a long week, quietly smoking on his pipe, when suddenly, tap, 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 was heard in the cabin. John sat upright and looked around to see Lucy, who stood motionless at the threshold, listening and staring at him. For a few silent moments, neither of them spoke or moved. The cabin grew really silent, to the point that even the crickets outside had vanished. John leaned over to the leftmost window and peered out into the darkness and strained to detect any signs of movement. Tap, tap, tap. It was louder this time. John jumped up from his seat, dropping his pipe on the floor, and the earthenware jug Lucy had been carrying shattered onto the floor. The tapping was so loud and pronounced that there was no denying that the 3 knocks, evenly spaced, had rung out against the back door. John grabbed his rifle and he motioned for Lucy to get behind him as the tapping continued. Despite checking the door and around the cabin, no movement could be seen, and the tapping continued throughout most of the night. For 4 nights, the tapping would return at the same time, the same insistence, and the same pattern. 3 insistent taps, equally spaced, repeated over and over every single night until the early morning. John and Lucy had decided not to involve the children. On the fourth night, John again approached the back door with his rifle and yelled, "Who's there?" to no answer. The floorboards creaked as he walked to the back door, and the tapping repeated. John asked, "What in the hell do you want from me?" John waited for a response. 5 seconds passed, then 10. He'd had enough. He finally breathed in the stale cabin air and then bolted across the room. He hesitated for a second, unlatched the door, and yanked the handle back as hard as he could. It slammed against the side wall with enough force to startle him and Lucy. Peering out over the top of his rifle, he saw nothing. A lump formed in his throat. He lowered the gun to his hip and felt himself shaking with rage. Bang, bang, bang. 3 knocks rang out from across the room behind the farmer, louder and faster than it had ever been before, forcefully enough that they shook the entire house. One of the children screamed from the upstairs bedrooms. John spun around and ran to the front door, nearly knocking Lucy over before ripping the front door open. As with the back door, there was nobody, no movement, just inky blackness and dead silence. Upon close inspection of the home and grounds each morning after the knocking began, John found nothing stolen or vandalized. None of the livestock had been injured or taken, and no evidence whatsoever that a human had made a late-night visit to the cabin. Each night the knocks began to escalate, always in sets of 3, always evenly spaced. They grew in frequency and intensity, and often seemed to be coming from multiple places in the cabin at once. The knocks were forceful enough to rattle the house and wake the children, and kept most of the family up until the early morning. The strange noises would continue on a nightly basis, sometimes with greater or lesser intensity. John and Lucy, determined to find a solution on their own, swore their children to secrecy for fear of damaging the family's reputation. And this is so funny to me, like, don't tell anyone that we're being attacked because I don't want them to think about Satan. It's funny now. I understand why they felt that way back then, but it's funny to me now. Being part of an area of superstitions, the idea of a haunting or the suggestion that they were involved in some kind of witchcraft would be enough to have them removed from the church and ostracized. You could literally get banished from your community if they thought that you were doing some kind of dark magic, which is just interesting evolution in U.S. Christianity. Before long, the knocking would be accompanied by even more sinister sounds. Richard Bell, the second youngest son of John and Lucy, reflects later on about the early disturbances in his essay, Our Family Troubles. Father and mother occupied a room on the first floor. Elizabeth had the room above, and the boys occupied another room on the second floor. John and Drury had a bed together, and Joel and myself slept in another bed. As I remember, it was a Sunday night, just after the family had retired. A noise commenced in our room like a gnat. A gnat? I combined the next 2 words. A rat gnawing vigorously on the bedpost. John and Drew got up to kill the rat, but the moment they were out of bed, the noise stopped. They examined the bedstead, but discovered no marks made by a rat. As soon as they returned to bed, the noise commenced again. Thus it continued until late hour or sometime after midnight, and we were all up 6 times or more, searching the room everywhere, every nook and corner for the rat, turning over everything. We could find nothing, not even a crevice by which a rat could possibly enter. This kind of noise continued from night to night, and week after week, and all of our investigations were in vain. The noise after a while was accompanied by a scratching sound like a dog clawing the floor, and the increase in force until it became evidently that it was too strong to be a rat. Then every room in the house was torn up, the furniture, the beds, the clothing, everything was examined, and still nothing irregular could be found. Nor was there a hole or a crevice by which the rat could enter, and nothing was accomplished beyond the increase of our confusion and evil forebodings. The demonstrations continued to increase, and finally the bed covers commenced slipping off at the foot of the beds, as if gradually drawn by someone, and occasionally a noise like the smacking of lips, and then a gulping sound, like someone was choking or strangling, while the vicious gnawing at the bedpost continued. There was no such thing as sleep to be thought of until the noise ceased, which was generally between 1 and 3 o'clock in the morning. Man, I would be so upset. And then, of course, as this continues, the more sleep-deprived you get, the more easily you are to scare. The worse it feels, the worse it sounds. Richard also recounts how the haunting began to escalate, saying the family had retired early. I had just fallen into a sweet doze. Then I felt my hair beginning to twist, and then with a sudden jerk which raised me, I felt like the top of my head had been taken off. Immediately Joe yelled in a great fright, and next Elizabeth was screaming in her room, and ever after that something was continuously pulling at her hair when she went to bed. Again, that would suck so much. The nightly episodes became increasingly violent. Furniture was flipped over, sheets were ripped from the beds, hair was pulled, faces were slapped. Upon returning home from work, the bellmen would often have stones and firewood thrown at them. The family and their slaves reported visions of dead men's candles. Sometimes this is like a jack-o'-lantern, slowly drifting from the tree line and floating towards the house. These wisps were believed to be a dark omen of death. Having been sufficiently worn down, John Bell finally decided to confide in one of his closest friends and neighbors, James Johnston. Upon hearing John's claims, James and his wife immediately agreed to spend the night at the Bell residence. Hoping to witness the activity for themselves, James also was very deeply religious, insisted on leading the family in worship before bed. Together they read scripture and sang hymns for some time. Eventually everyone made their way to their rooms and settled in to try to get some rest. The activity began that night at around the usual time and soon woke the entire household. It was more spectacular and exuberant than normal, as if the responsible party was eager to impress the new guests. Chairs were thrown around, linens were stripped off beds, knocking, choking, scratching sounds filled the air in each bedroom. The Johnstons were overwhelmed by what they were seeing and hearing. "In the name of the Lord, what are you?" James called out after witnessing some of the chaos. "What do you want and why are you here?" Strangely, his question seemed to cause an immediate lull in the activity, and it did not start up again until an hour or so later. Johnston concluded that the force behind the disturbances must possess some level of intelligence. The next morning, he urged John to seek help from the church and the community at large. John agreed to put his fears aside and approach church leadership for help. As word spread of the haunting, visitors began to call on the Bells to witness the activity themselves. This is like going to the movie theater in the 1800s. Someone's like, "Wait, what's going on at their house? Oh my God, we gotta go watch." I also love how people would just show up. Just like someone hears that you're having a really rough time or you're struggling with insomnia, so they come and sit in your living room to see if they hear anything. Nice. But I understand there's not really much else to do. As its notoriety grew, the entity's power seemed to grow with it. It began whispering. What is going on? I swear, this is my first time ever doing something like this, and you put a microphone in front of me, and I can't read. I don't know why. It began whistling, mumbling short syllables, and eventually it began to whisper. Suddenly, the spirit began to speak clearly in a distinctly feminine voice. "Of course it's a female witch." News of a talking spirit spread rapidly, attracting the fascinations of even more people from Adams and the surrounding communities. The spirit was becoming a local celebrity. When the spirit began to talk openly, there was an occasion. When asked, "Who are you and what do you want?" she proclaimed, "I am a spirit. I was once very happy, but now have been disturbed and made unhappy." She was then asked, "How were you disturbed and what makes you unhappy?" She replied, "I am a spirit of a person who was buried in the woods nearby, and my grave has been disturbed. My bones disinterred and scattered, and one of my teeth was lost under this house, and I am here looking for it." The family suddenly remembered discovering a grave mound years earlier while clearing a section of land. John Bell was careful to avoid touching it or the land around it, presuming it to be an Indian burial site. Good call, John. Days later, young Drew Bell told the neighbor boy Corbin Hall about the burial site, and the two decided to search for the relics. Of course they did. The boys found nothing of value or interest, but they decided to take a corpse's jawbone as a trophy. Just, like, I get it, you're young boys, but, also, I understand someone picking up, an arrowhead or something, but, what are you going to do with a jawbone? Anyways. Back at the house, the jawbone was dropped, and the tooth was knocked loose and lost in a crack in the floor. John Bell Sr. discovered the bone later that day, reprimanded the boys severely, and tasked one of his slaves with returning it to the grave. This memory prompted the family to search for the missing tooth, going as far as to rip up sections of the floor to dig on the earth beneath it. After a whole day of scouring the crawl space under the cabin, the spirit finally called out, laughing and admitting it was all a joke to fool Old Jack, which was her favorite nickname for John Bell Sr. It soon became apparent that the witch harbored a special hatred for Elizabeth Betsy Bell, the family's youngest daughter, reserving her most vicious punishments for her. And it would become clear throughout this story that the spirit really hated Betsy, and she really hated John Bell Sr. Betsy, who was 12 when the paranormal activity began, was brutally slapped, pinched, torn from bed, made to suffer spells of near suffocation for 30 to 40 minutes at a time, which sometimes caused her to lose consciousness. The spirit was vocal about her outrage over Betsy's courtship with Joshua Gardner, her childhood sweetheart and fiancé. She would provide no details or no explanation with her disagreement with the relationship or her hatred of Betsy. The attacks upon Betsy became so severe that her parents would send her away to spend the night at various neighbors' homes in hopes that she would be spared and get some sleep. It did not work. Everywhere Betsy went, the spirit followed. Betsy is quoted as saying, "When the spirits became so tantalizing, filling my mind with horror, causing me to become so nervous, my parents sent me to a neighbor's house to rest. The first night away from home was spent with Fenny Thorne. Where we retired, there came a loud knocking on the outside door, which seemed to fly open with a great gust of wind. Fenny sprang up at once and lit a candle, and to our surprise, the door wasn't open. Then a voice spoke softly. "Betsy, you should not have come over here. You know I can follow you anywhere. Now get a good night's sleep." I don't like that. I just gave myself goosebumps. That would actually legitimately freak me out. Like, I'm kind of on the fence about paranormal stuff sometimes, but if I heard something like that, I definitely wouldn't be sleeping. That's for sure. The attacks on Betsy were so constant and severe that she developed what we know to be panic disorder. She became prone to fainting, feeling smothered. She couldn't breathe. She would become listless from the lack of sleep. Even after the haunting and her marriage to her former teacher, Richard Powell, in 1824, Betsy refused to speak about the haunting, refused to sleep alone, and would only sleep between the wall and her husband. During this time, John Bell Sr. began to complain of stiffness in his mouth and tongue that he described as feeling like having a stick stuck crosswise in your mouth, punching out the side of your cheeks. It was often difficult for him to eat and drink. He also began suffering from facial contortions and seizures, the severity and duration of which would grow with time. The spirit loved it when he was in pain and would proudly declare that she would torture old Jack Bell until the end of his life. And like with Betsy, she never gave any explanation as to why she didn't like John, but she hated him. While the spirit showed particular animosity towards John Bell Sr. and Betsy, it loved some of the other family members. Once the spirit appeared to John Jr. the night before he was tasked to travel to North Carolina and settle one of his father's estates. It instructed John Jr. not to go on the trip, predicting bad luck, insisting he would return empty-handed, and told him that he should instead stay in Adams and meet an elegant young lady from Virginia who would soon be visiting. It informed John that this woman would please him and could be won over if he would stay. He laughed at the spirit, ignoring its plea, and left as planned. As predicted, his week-long journey was for nothing. He came back empty-handed, and the young woman had came and went in his absence. The entity also professed a deep, deep love for Lucy Bell, once describing her as the most perfect woman to walk the earth. In September of 1820, Lucy suffered from pleurisy, and pleurisy is inflammation of the pleura, the membranes that separate your lung from the chest wall. So this can be caused by bacterial infections or influenza and can cause severe pain when breathing in and out. The spirit brought Lucy hazelnuts and grapes and sang hymns to comfort her. When Lucy recovered, she was said to be overjoyed. Travelers continued to flood to the farm to communicate with the disembodied voice. Skeptics showed up to disprove the phenomena. Okay, so now, we've got visitors that are coming to sit in the living room to see if they hear anything, and the other person who shows up to tell you that you're lying. Love it. The spirit was constantly questioned about who she was and what she wanted. She would often refuse to answer, and when she did, the story would constantly change. She once declared that she was a resident of the Old North State, referring to North Carolina, possibly implying that it had followed the Bells from their journey from North Carolina into Tennessee. One night, Reverend James Gunn inquired about the entity's origin and motive. She replied, "I am the spirit of an early emigrant, and who brought a large sum of money and buried my treasure for safekeeping until needed. In the meanwhile, I died without divulging the secret, and I have returned in spirit for the purpose of making my hiding place known. I want Betsy Bell to have the money." We are hitting some Hollywood high points. We've got forbidden love, a spirit, and now we've got treasure. Those listening encouraged the spirit to explain where the treasure was hidden. The spirit agreed to reveal the location of the stash, provided that Drew Bell and Bennett Porter be the ones who exhume it under the supervision of James Johnston, and every dollar was to go to Betsy Bell. She instructed them to search a specific location on the bank of the Red River and urged them to leave before the rumor spread and the treasure was lost to someone else. They left early the next morning and proceeded to spend half the day dislodging a huge rock and the other half digging a massive trench. They found nothing and returned hungry and exhausted. That night, the witch showed up, absolutely delighted that men had been so easily duped. She described the dig in a humorous, ludicrous fashion, repeating things that the men had said verbatim and generally making fun of them. So, and it does say in all of the sources that the visitors who would come loved this story, because the spirit would sit there and just mock all of the men, being like, "Ha, gotcha." But she would also quote them directly. So people are amazed that she can do that, but also it became like a big gossip story. As the spirit grew stronger, she developed a strong affinity for repeating scripture, sermons, and hymns. She would mimic the prayers of James Johnston, who she called Sugar Lips, in his own voice, sing lines of traditional hymns, and engage in theological debates. Visitors of the Bell home participated in a game of opening the Bible at random and asking the spirit to recite a selected verse. She would also correct anyone who misquoted a scripture. One Sunday, both Reverend James Gunn and Reverend Shug Fort gave sermons at 11 a.m., 13 miles apart. Both ministers visited the Bell family that night, and the spirit asked them questions relating to their sermon, saying, "I was there, I heard you." The spirit then went on to accurately recite both sermons in the preacher's own voices. Both men confirmed that it was an accurate replay of the sermon that they had given at the same time that morning. The witch would also be able to tell specifics about their past, but she would have no way of knowing. During a discussion about the commandment against coveting and theft, a young man said he did not think it was wrong to steal food if one was starving. The spirit immediately asked the man if he ate the sheepskin. The man fell silent and never returned to future meetings. The group then remembered that he had been accused of stealing a sheepskin. The spirit caused further upset in the community by becoming a prolific gossip and a snitch, exposing secrets and tattling on local residents. This cracks me up because considering the culture of the time, like, you have all the holy rollers and all the, like, everyone's super spiritual. And then, like, you've got, like, this spirit just coming around being like, I know what you did last summer. My tea is not hot, but I bet hers was. So I've been referring to this entity as both a spirit and a witch. For the early part of the haunting, she was considered to just be the Bell spirit, is usually how she was referred. But it wasn't until Reverend James Gunn asked again very sincerely for the spirit to explain who she was, why she was there, that she finally replied, "I'm old Kate Batts' witch." She went on to state that she was determined to torment old Jack Bell out of his life. Kate Batts was a local woman that Richard Bell was described as eccentric and sensitive. When her husband Frederick became chronically ill, she managed his business affairs and property, earning her some disapproval from the community by participating in a man's role. She's taking care of her invalid husband and not starving to death, and she's getting criticism for it. It makes me think of my favorite podcaster, Dan Cummins, who's always like, "Burn the witch." It's crazy. Her eccentricity and unusual lifestyle led people to believe that she practiced black magic. Of course she did. She wears the pants of the relationship. How dare she? When Kate and Frederick struggled for money, Kate decided to sell some property to make ends meet. Kate and Frederick's brother, Benjamin, had a dispute with John Bell Sr. where Kate claimed that John took advantage of her and violated their agreement. Now, for the most part, I think that Kate's totally fine. Like, she's taking care of her invalid husband. She's managed, she's on business. The one thing strange that they do talk about her doing is that she was reported to always beg for hairpins from any woman she encountered. No matter how many she had in, no matter if she needed them or not, it was like a fixation that she had around hairpins. But outside of that, she just seems like a woman trying to live. Anyways, so they had this property dispute with John Bell Sr. The dispute began in 1816 over the sale of a slave. Bell Sr. had agreed to buy a young slave from Benjamin and gave him $100 for her. Batts argued that she was worth far more and wanted to sell her for a higher price. Bell Sr. then told him that if he did choose to sell her for a higher price, Benjamin needed to pay him back $150 for his trouble. So essentially charging 50% interest is what he wanted to do. Benjamin presented this case to the church, which originally found Bell Sr. innocent, because this is considered usury, which a lot of churches frowned upon. It wasn't technically legal. But in the fall of 1817, the court of law did actually find John guilty of usury. It's an illegal practice of lending money at an unreasonably high rate. You can think of that as like a loan shark. So he did eventually get convicted of that, and then the Red River Baptist Church responded to the court's ruling by excommunicating John Bell on charges of covetousness and contempt. So this is why Kate Batts did not like John Bell Sr. Kate Batts was rumored to have vowed revenge on John over this dispute under the pretense of taking advantage of her family's misfortune. While no meaningful evidence of any link between Kate Batts and the spirit ever came to light, the entity from there on out would respond readily to the name of Kate, and many locals thought it was possible that the strange Kate Batts had conjured a witch. Of course. Shortly after Kate announced her name, 4 entities were brought into the household claiming to be a witch family. So, again, I'm kind of on the fence with paranormal stuff, right? Like, sometimes you'll hear a story and you'll be like, cool story, bro. Awesome. And sometimes you'll hear things be like, hey, you know what? That might have actually happened. And I have had a couple experiences myself where maybe it was real. You know, I believe in like evil and dark forces. But this part cracks me up. Okay, so now we know who Kate is. 4 entities come into the house to be a little witchy witch family. One was called Black Dog and was the head of the family and spoke in a harsh feminine tone. Both mathematics and cryptography, those are names, spoke in softer feminine tones, and Jerusalem spoke like a boy. Okay, so now we've got Kate, Black Dog, mathematics, cryptography, and Jerusalem. And I don't know why that's hilarious, but it is. The arrival of new voices and the increase of activity not only frightened the family, but scared off visitors who were worried it was an omen. The group of spirits would alternate between singing together, arguing amongst themselves, blaspheming and cursing loudly, and making noises like a group of men in a brawl. This particular form of spiritual activity did not last long. When I think of these spirits arguing, I think of in the early part of Boondock Saints when Connor and Murphy are in the bar. They're celebrating St. Patrick's Day. The bartender has Tourette's and he's yelling the random like out of order phrases. And then the Russians come in and the Russians are like, you need to clear out. And they're like, no, it's St. Patty's Day. Everyone's Irish. Have a drink with us. And he's like, you will go or we will make you go. I imagine that Black Dog had a harsh Russian accent and cryptography and mathematics had Irish accents, and then Jerusalem is gonna be our Italian guy. But I imagine that kind of scene where everybody's having a great time, Black Dog gets pissed, and then it's a brawl and somebody gets lit on fire. Also, if you've never seen Boondock Saints, do yourself a favor. Please watch it. Quality entertainment. For our mid-show sponsor break. This episode is brought to you by Intravenous Solutions, Nashville's premier IV therapy and wellness center. IV therapy can help you recover quicker from heavy workouts or illness, treat the symptoms of dehydration, and improve sleep and give you healthy, glowing skin. Being on stage several times a week, I can say that IV treatments have kept me on my feet and literally are a lifesaver. Dr. Allen and his staff are so kind and so knowledgeable, and they make sure that every appointment is welcoming and easy. They also offer vitamin shots, oxygen therapy, Botox, filler, weight management, and mobile services. With 4 locations in Nashville, Hendersonville, Franklin, and their brand new location on 2nd Avenue in the Bankers Alley Hotel by Hilton, it is so easy to get high-quality care all week. So come party in Nashville and beat the hangover at Intravenous Solutions. Give the code Monty10 at checkout for a 10% discount on services. As the Bell Witch's fame continued throughout the region, a professional investigator who introduced himself only as Detective Williams reportedly traveled a great distance to unravel the mystery of the witch. He was described as a stocky, well-dressed, and handsome man who was not shy about announcing his achievements to others. He did not believe in the supernatural and insisted that there must be a logical explanation for the haunting. Unlike with most visitors, Kate did not reveal herself immediately to Williams, and eventually he became flustered and annoyed, suggesting that the family invented the story of the witch for their own personal gain. Outraged, John Bell Sr. pushed back against this claim and then went to his bedroom to calm down, where Kate whispered to him that she would ensure Mr. Williams would learn he's not as smart as he thinks he is. Late that night, Kate pinned Detective Williams to his pallet and began mercilessly beating and scratching him. She sarcastically demanded he tell her which of the Bell family was holding him down, mocked him mercilessly as he panicked, and then just as quickly, she vanished. Williams was so terrified that he stayed up all night with a candle and weapon in hand. At first light, he readied his horse and could not be persuaded to stay for breakfast. William Porter was a good friend of the Bell family and was known for his integrity and good standing in the community. He would often come visit and support the Bells during their troubles. He frequently spent hours entertaining Kate, which was the only way for the family to get any rest. Porter claimed to be fond of talking to Kate, and she seemed to admire him as well. Porter was at the time a bachelor and later told the Bell family that Kate had come to visit him in his home. According to Porter, on a cold night, he felt the cover of his bed pulling back, and he recognized Kate's voice saying, "Billy, I've come to sleep with you and keep you warm." Porter warned her, "Well, Kate, if you're going to sleep with me, you must behave yourself." He then felt the covers pull away from him and twist into a roll at the foot of the bed, much like a child would to completely roll themselves in a blanket like a caterpillar. Porter leaped out of bed, recognizing this as an opportunity to get rid of the witch, grabbed the rolled blanket, and began to carry it toward the fire. As he lifted the blanket, he noticed it was very heavy and had a terrible stench. He was only able to carry it about halfway across the room before it got so heavy and the odor so offensive that he could not continue to carry it. He ran out of the room to get fresh air, and upon returning, discovered Kate and the horrible smell were gone. General Andrew Jackson, who lived in the Hermitage near Nashville, reportedly visited the Bells after hearing rumors of the spirit. When Jackson and his men arrived at the homestead, their horses stopped and refused to go over the property line until a disembodied voice gave them permission. Jackson purportedly remarked that the Bell Witch must be behind it. That night, after making camp on the Bell farm, one of Jackson's men was loudly boasting about his exploits as a witch hunter, talking in detail about slaying supernatural entities with silver bullets. Of course he did. Andrew Jackson is reported to have said, "I bet this fellow is an arrant coward. By the eternal, I do wish the thing would come. I want to see him run." Moments later, the witch appeared and challenged the man to shoot it. When he tried, he could not get his gun to fire, and he fell to the ground, screaming and flailing his arms, clearly in extreme pain. The man claimed to feel thousands of needles prickling him. The spirit delighted in his anguish and could be heard cackling throughout the encampment. After some time, feeling the soldier had been sufficiently punished for his hubris, the entity released him and continued to laugh loudly as he took off in a panic across the room and out of sight. Later that night, many of the general's men complained of unprovoked attacks against them as well, reportedly feelings of being cruelly pinched or stuck with needles. Many of them had bruises, cuts, and welts to support their claims. Upon witnessing the evidence of abuse, Andrew Jackson ordered his men to immediately pack up and move out, exclaiming, "I would rather fight the British in New Orleans than spend another night in the company of the Bell Witch." And this is one of those things, I mean, it's an interesting story, but I do wonder that if this did happen, why Andrew Jackson didn't write about it. Just a little question. At the height of the Bell Witch haunting, many self-proclaimed magicians, wise men, and witch doctors arrived to study the entity and to banish it. John Sr.'s health was beginning to deteriorate rapidly, and his facial spasms and stiff tongue were becoming more of a nuisance each day. He absolutely believed that the witch's intention was to kill him, and she was succeeding. As it happened, there was a famous magician named Dr. Mize living in Simpson County, Kentucky. James Johnson offered to ride up to his home to summon him. What I find interesting about this part of the story is that there's this huge fear surrounding witchcraft and the occult and the devil and all this stuff. But at the same time, now they're going to summon a magician who apparently is a professional magician from Kentucky. Wishing to keep the trip a secret from the rest of the family, Drew Bell and Mr. Johnston left for Kentucky very early the next morning. They successfully located Dr. Mize at his home and explained the situation. He assured them that although he did not typically work with spirits, he was confident he would be able to remove the curse and exorcise the witch from their home. He guaranteed his arrival in Adams in 10 days to rid them of the problem. So see here, they're like, we got to keep it secret. There's demons. Anyways. The doctors come as promised. Oddly enough, the witch didn't appear at all for the first 4 days of his stay. During his inspections of the homestead, Mize discovered an old shotgun that had been unable to fire for some time and stated with certainty that Kate had put a spell on it, assuring the Bells he would be able to return it to working order. In his arrogance, he talked at length about his accomplishments and downplayed the seriousness of the haunting, boasting that the witch would be no match for him. I feel like famous last words, overly confident here. 3 days later, as Mize was purifying the house with various tinctures and incantations, Kate appeared suddenly and began interrogating him. Mize chose to remain elusive, practically ignoring her, and she accused him of omitting key ingredients in his mixtures and not knowing what he was doing. Kate mocked and cursed at the doctor until he became so flustered and embarrassed that he announced his plan to depart from the Bell home the following morning. When Dr. Mize tried to leave, his horse refused to budge, rearing up, kicking its hooves and snorting. Kate's voice sang out across the farm, "I know how to make the horse move." Instantly, the horse bolted, carrying Mize off as he struggled and barely clutched the mane. Kate later said she made a trip home with the old fraud and recounted it in great detail. Dr. Mize gone, and the hope of getting rid of Kate dwindling, John Bell's health began to worsen. His face frequently jerked and twitched, and the swelling and stiffness of his tongue distorted his features. Towards the end of 1820, John became so sick and weak that he was put on permanent bed rest. Despite his condition, he insisted on rising early with the family and eating with them at the table. But on the morning of December 19th, 1820, John didn't come out to breakfast. His son, John Bell Jr., went to check on his father, who was in a stupor and couldn't get out of bed. John looked in the medicine cabinet where his father's prescriptions were kept. Inside, he discovered it completely empty except for a vial of smoky dark liquid he did not recognize. They sent for the family doctor, George Hobson, and a few of their neighbors. Kate was over the moon as the visitors came in. She was giggling and singing, "It's useless for you to try to relieve old Jack. I've got him this time, and he will never get up from that bed again." When asked about the strange liquid, Kate said, "I put it in there. I gave old Jack a big dose of it last night while he was asleep, and it fixed him." The doctor did not recognize the bottle, but they did take a few drops of the dark liquid and gave it to the family cat, who reportedly jumped, spun a few times, stretched out, and died very quickly. John Bell lay in a near catatonic state for a full day, unresponsive and limp. All attempts to revive him failed, and he died the next day on December 20th. The vial was thrown into the fire where it burst into bright blue flames. After John's death, Kate's antics subsided drastically. She quieted down and very rarely spoke or moved anything. In the spring of 1821, she bid the family goodbye and that she would return in 7 years' time. Kate briefly returned to the original homestead in 1828, making her presence known, but in knocking and pulling the bedding, but her general basic kind of quieter thing. She didn't really come back and speak to anyone. Lucy Bell died shortly after, and the original property was divided among heirs. Kate is rumored to have revisited the family one more time in 1935 and has not been heard from since. And that is the complete legend of the Bell Witch. And as I was researching this, I found this true story account from between 2004 and 2008 from someone who lived in Adams. So I'm going to kind of leave the Bell Witch there for a second and tell this story. I found this story to be so incredibly compelling. I wanted to share it with you. So much more recent, but still in Adams, near actually the property that this takes place on, touches the Bell property where the Bell Witch was. Here we go. I lived in Adams, Tennessee, growing up from ages 14 to 18, 2004 to 2008. A couple of weeks after my family and I moved there, something unexpected happened. I was mowing with my dad's tractor, was going down a hill when my horizon line violently was thrown around and the tractor tires hit something. I disengaged the mower, pulled the tractor around the base of the hill that I had just gone down. My blood went cold as I looked through the swath I had just cut, like a buzzer going down the middle of someone's head making a lane in the grass. In that lane were 4 Native American burial grounds. My parents started reaching out to anyone who might be able to help us identify the graves. Anthropologists, historians, accredited people. Those people unanimously agreed that these 4 graves were from the Trail of Tears. They corroborated this from what I remember because of how the graves were laid, very shallow with a giant slab of stone on top, and the fact that they were interned on the side of a hill to keep water from sinking in and raising the bodies. I consider myself very logically driven and rationally minded, but I usually let my empirical senses explain something before I'll open myself up to other possibilities. Yet there were things that happened to me and my whole family that we were not able to rationalize with the scientific method or anything logical. Immediately following this incident, the activity in our house started shortly after. We heard heavy knocking and pounding on the brick outer layer of the house, encircling the house. No matter where in the house you stood, you could hear the knocking. Some nights I would hear running footsteps accompanying the pounding. This activity happened almost every night. Event number 2, things continued to escalate. One night I was letting my golden retriever out to go pee. We had a ranch-style house overlooking the Red River. The door where we were exiting was on the back side of the house facing the river. As I opened the door, I start hearing faint whispering, akin to leaves being blown and scratching across the ground. I looked up at the trees to see if the wind was blowing, but everything was still. The scratchy blowing leaf noise continued, but as it continued, it got closer and louder. It sounded like the language of some sort. You'd imagine an incantation or something nefarious in the tone. I looked down at my golden retriever. All of the hair on her back was standing up, and she was snarling like a rabid wolf, but wasn't barking. She was just kind of frozen in a fear response. I started getting extremely nauseous and could smell sulfur. I was completely frozen when finally my dog launches herself through the door's threshold and starts gnashing her teeth midair and chomping. The voices were now coming from directly in front of me. I could hear them as if someone was standing there or maybe a foot or 2 away. I grabbed my dog midair and pulled her quickly inside, slammed the door, and threw the deadbolts in place. Event number 3. This happened when I was coming home from football practice. I had all my gear in my gym bag over my left shoulder. This is important because of how I enter the house. As I closed the front door behind me, I began setting my gear bag down from my left side, which caused me to look to the right. The room where you first walk in was our library, where we had a leather couch, chair, piano, bookshelves, and a wooden rocking chair. There was something sitting in the rocking chair. My peripheral vision caught it at first, and the chair going back and forth. As my vision centered on the chair, there was a humanoid shape sitting there, head glancing downward at the book it was holding. Long black hair was drawn over its head, completely void of light. To picture what I saw, imagine the silhouette of a person, but rather just a void of light. The light coming in around the edges of it seemed to be eaten up by the presence or the void, as light spilled over the edges of the humanoid shape. I felt like I had jumped off a bridge into ice-cold water. I blasted myself back against the door, screaming, and fell down. As I was falling, I saw the void blur, suddenly as it shot across the walls of the house, through a huge bay window over the river. My golden retriever was in the next room, and she sprinted to chase down the shadow across the walls, barking and clawing at the walls. After it left through the window, the dog came to me and laid on my lap until my parents got home. Event number 4, I was fishing with my cousin by the river at our house. We were right on the bend of the river, so the moon would be shining on both sides of the river, racing down 2 lines at a 90-degree angle from the house. It's very beautiful when you're not on edge. The reason I bring this up is there was a lot of light on the river. Jack was about 10 or so at the time. He reaches up and taps and says, "Does that lady need help?" I looked to where he was pointing, and there was a pale woman dressed in white clothes, going back and forth, picking up stones just to the left of us across the river. I had seen her many times before, around the property, and whenever I would get close, she would disappear behind a tree or something similar. Knowing this, I told Jack calmly as I could that it was time for dinner and we needed to go to my mom immediately. Event number 5. Myself, my dad, and his friends, and some other family members were staked out along the river bend on a gravel bar beneath the rise to our house. Nothing out of the ordinary. It was July 4th. We were having a good time. We were all spread out about 15 yards from each other. Each man had low-end gas Coleman lanterns. As the sun was setting, my dad looks over at me like something was bothering him. He told me later he felt like someone had just thrown a bucket of ice water over him. The sun had just gone down when this happened. In unison, all the lanterns were cranked up at full blast, then as quickly became barely aflame, roared to life again, down to barely aflame, roared to life, and then completely went out. Right as the flames went out, we heard the most God-forsaken scream from some woman across the river. At this point, all the flashlights came on when something started swimming and splashing around the water on both sides of the river bend. The splashing receded towards the opposite gravel bar, and whatever it was got out and started pacing back and forth across the rocks there. We were all pointing all of our flashlights to where the sound was coming from, but we couldn't identify where it was originating. It's safe to say we were running up the hill at this point. Event 6, Lost Time. I was walking through the woods near the Bell Witch Cave. One moment it was completely sunny, blue skies about mid-afternoon. The next moment it was overcast and looked maybe 4 p.m. Event 7, Night Terrors, Torture Dreams, being held down, brutally drawn and quartered. I was dreaming of walking through the house and the void person placing their hand on my chest, pushing through my solar plexus, and violently shaking me in the dream like having a seizure. Event 8, I visited the Bell House and Plantation Marker in a tobacco field adjacent to my family's property. Brought friends to try to prove something crazy was happening to my family. The rite of passage in the area is to go to the stone marker where the paranormal events happened hundreds of years ago, then dance on the stone saying, "I don't believe in the Bell Witch." I got them to promise that they would not do that while we went there. Of course, the moment we get there, one guy who doubted the legend in a massive way jumps up onto the stone marker and starts screaming, "I don't believe in the Bell Witch." Of course you don't. As loud as he could. I get so upset at him. I'm the only one who knows the way back, and I said, "Come on, guys, we're leaving." In this area, it's known as the Tennessee River Valley. There's tons of flowing water around the tobacco fields, and the reason that this is important is because of what happens next. We're making good time walking back across the crop field, hundreds of yards long. A mist starts to roll in from the river and begins to saturate the field. The temperature drops easily 25 degrees or so, and we start to see our breath. I begin to smell sulfur in the breeze. As the mist becomes a fog, I started hearing this wheezy and deeply cavernous sounding breath around us, like being inside a cave that was breathing. Out of nowhere, we started hearing these giant blasting sounds, and I realized something was walking on the chopped tobacco stalks. So with tobacco stalks, when you step on them, they make like a popping kind of blasting noise when they're dry and brittle. Then I hear it. The deep cavernous noise turns into this giant sniffing sound, like some kind of Lovecraftian beast smelling out its prey just out of sight. At this point, I yell "run" in pure panic mode. We take off across the field and try not to be skewered on the stalks. They are dry out and they are really sharp at harvest time. As we are exiting the field, our feet hit the gravel road. The lower center part of my back suddenly explodes in agony, and I look down. There's a massive rock laying at my feet, and I realize I have just been assaulted. By the time I get to the house and examine my back in a mirror, the bruise was about the size of a basketball and was already turning black. Event number 8. Woke up outside and 3 a.m. I was laying next to those 4 graves on the property. I'm not scared by much, but I would be so terrified you might have to check me in somewhere if I wake up next to 4 graves after all of this. The night was awfully cold, but I woke up soaked in sweat. We lived there for so long that I have many events to share and process, and willing to have the discussion about my time there with you all. It's really hard for me to talk about this stuff without re-traumatizing myself, but my friends and family are encouraging me to share my experience with like-minded people so I can find peace surrounding the trauma. So that to me is terrifying, especially for me, the part where he wakes up next to the graves. It's almost like whatever it was like, you're next. But anyway, so that's a true story, quotation marks, from Reddit about the Adams area. And I love the story of the Bell Witch, and I actually went to the cave myself. And when you come to Nashville, we're going to get into the part of the show now where it's travel recommendations. When you get to Nashville, I highly recommend going to see that. They're only open between, I believe, the end of May until October because it's seasonal. But definitely go up there. When I was there, the history was super interesting. The cave is very spooky. You go in, there is a grave. There's graves in Indian burial ground kind of above the cave entrance. And then there's graves on the inside. And people actually, there used to be, when you came to the Bell Witch Cave, there's a small grave. It was a child's grave. The skeleton was there. And people came and stole it because people are shitty and horrible and apparently really stupid. But when you go in, I will say the cave is extremely, like, reverent. Reverence the word I'm looking for. You kind of walk in and you just kind of... And for myself, nothing paranormal or interesting happened when I was at the cave. But one of my bandmates and his girlfriend went. And they were taking pictures in the cave. They tell you not to take video. When they looked through the pictures later, there was a blue orb in all of their photos following them around. So definitely when you come to Nashville, definitely go to the Bell Witch Cave. It's an amazing legend. Don't pick anything up, okay? That's a huge thing they tell you. There are stories all over Reddit where people have taken a stone or an arrowhead that they found, and as soon as they leave with it, problems happen. One person got into a car accident as they left the property. Another person ended up having a really severe fall and broke both their legs, like financial distress. There's tons of stories, and it keeps happening until they send the rock or the arrowhead back. There's actually, they have trays in the gift shop area of rocks and arrowheads that have been sent back by people that took them and started to get hurt. And our tour guide, when I was there, she talked about how she found an arrowhead when she was there. She gave it to an intern and said, hey, take this to the gift shop because they keep them. And she said, but don't leave with it. The intern put it in his pocket, forgot. And they both go home. It's the end of their workday. Both of them had banging on their doors, banging on their walls, huge disturbances the entire night. The tour guide comes back the next day and she asks him, like, did you leave that? And he's like, no, I left with it. So he took it home. So they left it the second night. But the first night, it didn't bother just him, the intern who took it with him, but also the tour guide who originally picked it up. And again, this part of the show is the travel portion. So my goal with these recommendations is to give you places that are a little less touristy, like more hidden gems, things like that, especially being local to Nashville now. I'm going to give you my favorite things, my favorite bars, my favorite bands, and some of the touristy stuff that I think is really worth seeing. First, we're going to start with bars. So my favorite bar in Nashville is called the Fox Bar. It's in East Nashville. It's got this really cool speakeasy vibe. It's really dark. It's very moody. They have the best Manhattan I have ever had in my life. But be careful because that thing will bitch slap you across the face. I'm 5'10", super muscular, drink more than I should, and two of those will have me in a very good place. Pearl Diver is another favorite of mine. It's another East Nashville bar. It's actually not far from Fox. But it's the most kind of creative and inventive kind of exotic environment. It kind of feels like you walked into an aquarium. And they have really just delicious, if you're a cocktail person, Pearl Diver is going to be your jam. And my third pick, I'm not going to give you all the bars I like because that would take forever. But my third pick is Attaboy. And it's this, I moved here from New York City, and Attaboy is the second iteration of New York City's Attaboy, which is a speakeasy type bar. You can tell what kind of bars I like. And if you're not looking for this place, you'll walk right by the building. So make sure you put it in a GPS. The cocktails are immaculate. And it's a great experience, but you should know that they do not accept reservations. So get there early because you have to just put your name on a list. And then restaurants. Okay. Again, there's so many restaurants. Like as Nashville grows, the food and the drinking and the music just gets better and better. Gannon's is actually my new recent favorite. I discovered this restaurant like 2 months ago, And Chef Gannon used to be a chef at the very popular venue of Skulls. He's from New Orleans originally. Gannon's is a New Orleans restaurant. The best turtle soup I've ever had in my life, and I've had a lot of turtle soup because it's delicious. The music's great. It's jazz. It's laid back. This is a great place to have a nice dinner. It's a little quieter. They have a great bourbon and wine list. And you can't come to Nashville without barbecue. My favorite barbecue spot is Peg Leg Porker. This is a very casual walk up and order at the counter. All the staple sides that you'd kind of associate with barbecue. The meats are amazing. The sides are great. And it's always consistently good. Like some of these places, whether it's a drive-through or a counter stop, sometimes it can be hit or miss. Peg Leg Porker is delicious every single time. And my third favorite restaurant, I am obsessed with Spain. I went to Spain 5 times in 1 year because I love it so much. And there's a new restaurant in Nashville called the Iberian Pig, which is traditional Spanish food. And this place has 4.9 stars, I think, on Google, and it deserves every one, and there's tons of reviews. This Spanish food is very authentic. It's a tapas-based restaurant. Again, this is probably a little bit more for a nicer dinner, but the food is just so good. So if you're a foodie and you kind of want to try something a little bit out of the norm, absolutely recommend the Iberian Pig. And this next section is tough, so I'm going to recommend some bands in Nashville, and all of my friends are in bands. All of them. So if you're listening to this and I don't mention you, it's not because I don't love you. I just can't mention everyone. And so I'm kind of going with the bands that I've seen the most. Yeah. So, and I'm going to tag a bunch of other bands in when I post this on Instagram and YouTube so you can find them based on your music preferences. But I'm going to give you my favorite. So obviously when you come to town, you have to see my band, Monty and the Monsters, obviously. So we do mostly pop, rock, and hip hop. Very fun show. You can find us. It's Monty Mater and Monty and the Monsters on Instagram. Other artists you need to see, Hayden Helms. Anywhere he's playing, anywhere he's singing, anything he does. He's typically at Johnny Cash's bar 6 to 10 on Mondays and Tuesdays, and at Nudies 6 to 10 on Wednesdays, and then 10:30 to close on Thursdays. This man can literally play anything, sings his face off, and him and his whole band are just beautiful humans. Another favorite band of mine is No Weak Links. This is Cooter Bennett's band. Another great human. This is like 80s and 90s rock. You go for it. It's such a fun band, and Ivy Andrews sings with them, and she's one of the best vocalists in town. They play all of it. They're super fun to watch. You can find them at Nudies Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturday at 6 to 10. And for you country people, my girl, Shayna G, is amazing. So I've seen her so many times because she opens in front of my band at Whiskey Row on Sundays, and she is so good. She's so good. She's so funny. She's so gorgeous. She sounds great. She tours a lot, so sometimes she's not in town, but if she is, you'll find her at Whiskey Row. Her Instagram handle is GEE is for gangster, so find her. And then this girl, oh my God. So this vocalist is one of my favorite vocalists in town. Her name is Kendall Wild. She is the most badass, sexy motherfucker I've ever seen. If you are familiar, if you follow Postmodern Jukebox, she just did the Def Leppard cover with them. That's her. So she's touring with them right now, but when she's in town, she performs at the 1230 Club, Electric Jane. Follow her, find a show. It is so inspiring to watch her perform. And again, I'm going to tag a whole bunch of other bands and their genres because there's just too many. There's just too many. And my friends, the Clever Alibis, they do all pop punk. I will tag more people, but those are the ones I have time to cover because I don't want this episode to be 2 hours of me just listing bands. Okay, places to see while you're here. Obviously, the Bell Witch Cave, Adams, Tennessee is a close drive. They're only open from May to October, so make sure you fit that in. It's a great experience. And this is touristy, but I will say, even if you aren't a country music fan, the Country Music Hall of Fame is super interesting. It's worth visiting at least once. But my favorite museum is just, it's so incredible, and I learned so much, is the National African American Museum of Music. It's mind-blowing. It is mind-blowing, and Nashville became Music City because of the Fisk Jubilee Singers, which was an HBCU, so historically black college. And It's HBC at the time, I think. Yeah. But they were a touring vocal group to raise money for the college. Nashville became famous because of that group. They actually performed for the Queen of England, and she was the one who said, "You must truly come from a music city." So even the name of Music City is based on African American history, and that museum is well worth seeing. If you've never been to Nashville, definitely visit downtown at least once. Come see the band, obviously. If you're not much of a partier, once will be enough. You'll be like, you know what? I'm good. I've seen it. I got the t-shirt. In the warmer months, there's a large park here that holds the Parthenon. Nashville used to be known as the Athens of the South. So in the 1800s, they actually built a replica, a like 2-scale replica of the Parthenon in Athens with the interior, with the goddess on the inside. It's really pretty. The park is beautiful. Definitely go see it. It's really a cool spot. And I'm going to circle back to music a little bit. So the bar scene downtown, you're going to see more of the country bands during the day. There's country bands all day and all night, but like you'll see some of the rock bands come out a little bit later, but the set lists are pretty similar for the most part. So if you're someone who you're like, okay, one day of crowds was enough, I want something a little different, a little quieter, there's just some really cool intimate music spots I wanted to tell you about. Close to Broadway, but not on Broadway, is Bourbon Street Blues and Boogie Bar. This is a New Orleans themed blues bar, and it's blues and funk and soul, and some of the best bands, my favorite bands in town, all play there. Before I moved to Nashville, I used to come here to record an EP, and I would go to the studio all day, and I would go there at night and watch the Corey Mack show until the bar closed. It's just amazing. Like, make sure you see Juju Winfield, Corey Mack show, and Loose Lips. All great. Anything Ping Rose does. It's just, you could literally spend all day there with just the best music. Rudy's Jazz Club. Now, this is a true dinner and jazz club. One of my favorite spots on nights I'm not working. It makes me kind of feel like I'm back in New York a little bit. And I've never had a bad experience there. Reggie Wooten plays there on Wednesday, and they do a jazz night. Giovanni Rodriguez and the 12 Manos are on Mondays. They're phenomenal. Just check the schedule. And I'm going to give you like a true local recommendation here. The Flamingo. So the Flamingo is this chic little bar and cocktail club. But every Wednesday they host what's called the Invite. So this is a jam session with vocalists and different band members, kind of like you'd see other places where it's kind of a free jam. But because it's called the Invite, because you can only perform or sit in if someone who has already performed or is part of the Invite vouches for you. So the music is really high quality. It's some of the best musicians I've ever seen play. It is absolutely worth the stop. So I could literally spend an hour just recommending things to see and do, but I'll send more later. Please like, comment, and subscribe to this podcast. Commenting and subscribing really helps me show up on playlists, especially for Apple Music. And I'm going to have my email in the show notes. Send emails of recommendations. I know that these first few episodes are going to be a little bit clunky because I'm running this entire setup myself and I've never done something like this before. But I would love recommendations. Also, topics. If you're like, I would love to hear something about this city or when this happened, like, please. Like, I have so many ideas and so many cities, but recommendations are great. I eventually want to go to cities and have a local host the podcast with me. So please send those in. My email is montyashleymater@gmail.com. It's in the show notes. Eventually, I'm going to have an email and a website just for the podcast, but for right now, I'm just going to manage it on my own. And please follow me at Monty Mater on Instagram and Facebook and YouTube and all the places. I'm trying to keep all my crazy in one location at the moment, but eventually it's all going to become part of one unit. But yeah, send in some comments. Please comment on the podcast. Tell me what you like, what you don't like, topics you'd be interested in. Now, I did kick this off with a paranormal story. This is mostly going to be true crime, really, moving forward, because true crime is my passion. We're just going to sprinkle some paranormal in there. But thank you so much for taking the time to listen to me and to share this story with me. Please come visit Nashville. Come say hi when you do. Thanks for rolling down the highway with me, and I'll see you next week.